If you could start by, if you could tell us your name and where you're from.
Alvin Sheffer. I grew up in Lithgow, which is 5 miles above Germantown. Went to the Germantown, school district.
Now I know you have a wealth of knowledge about the Palatines. If you could give us a brief history of who they were, where they came from, and why they came here.
They're called Palatines. They came from the section in Germany that's called the Palatine, or on an English, map, but it's the false area, on a German map. But in actuality, Philip Otterness in his book, Becoming, German, less than half of them actually came from the Palatine. But they became known as, Palatines. The same as, the Hessian troops that fought in the Revolutionary War were all called Hessians. Less than half of them came from Hessen. So it was sort of interesting that when the large migration came down, from the Rhine, and they didn't consider themselves Palatines. They considered themselves, they come from Waldeck or Hessen or something like that. But when they got to England, they realized that there was a small migration that came before them that were, all from the Palatinate, and they were getting advantages as far as food and help and everything. So they became, they accepted the, the terminology of Palatine, even though they weren't all from the Palatinate. Let me back up. Joshua Cokerthal was a Lutheran minister. He brought a small group of 51, give or take, a couple to what we know as Newburgh, now. And that was in 1708. He had some problems with, with the crown, and he went back. And surprisingly, when he got back, there was as many as 15,000 refugees that came from, the Rhine Valley and were in, England. So, Queen Anne and Governor Hunter were trying to place these 15,000, immigrants. Some of them went to Ireland. The younger ones were immediately put into the British Navy. But then they got the idea that they had all of this colony, the 13 colonies, that they would, send some of them, there to either Carolina, Pennsylvania. There were land agents that were actively going into the Rhine now to enlist people to come to the colonies. So, these 15,000 people, Hunter was an aide to the War of Spanish Succession was going on at the same time, and Queen Anne had became queen in 1702 with the death of her sister Mary, and she was fighting they were fighting the different the Spain and the other countries in what was called the War of Spanish Succession. So all of these people that came down the Rhine and wound up in the Netherlands. So there was this supposedly book that Cokerthal might have written before he brought the migration of 1708 down, which was called the Golden Book, and expounding the great resources and stuff in the New World. So Queen Anne didn't promise them free passage, but that was what was rumored, and that was one of the reasons why the 15,000 or so came down. So once they got to England, and they still had quite a few of them that they had a place. So Hunter, being he was a military man and knew that the British Navy was dependent on Sweden and Russia for their naval stores, approached the border trade with his plan that, well, if we send some of them to the new world, we can, you know, we can produce our own naval stores, and we won't be, bound to Sweden and Russia for all of the naval stores that the British Navy was needing. So Queen Anne had made Hunter the new governor of what was, the province of New York and New Jersey and, parts of Connecticut. So subsequently, he asked for ships to bring 3,000, people over, for this entrepreneurial thing to produce the naval stores. But he wasn't quite sure where he was going to, settle them. So the Forester General, who was for Queen Anne, was a gentleman named Bridger, and they came and they looked at a couple different, sites. One of them was in Schoharie, but that was, not too advantageous because of the transportation to get the naval stores, because you had, you could use the Mohawk, but you had the Cohoe Falls. So they eventually settled on the Hudson Valley, and Hunter negotiated with, Robert Livingston, who had acquired in 1683 and 1684 160,000 acres, and they bought back 6,000 acres for this project, which we know as mostly Germantown, today. So in the fall of 1710, they were brought up to here and established camps, what was called East Camp and West Camp. In the fall, there was 3 camps established on the east side and 2 camps on the west side, because all of them weren't well enough to make that trip. Because on the way over, 470 either died on the way over or immediately after, but there also was 35 births, which amazes me on the trip. But when they, when they got, ready to come up in the fall, they all couldn't go. So in the spring of 1711, there was another camp established on the east side and another camp on the west side. The reason I emphasize that is because a lot of historians will say that in 1710 there was 4 camps, established, but in actuality, if you look at the documentary history, it was only 3. Then the other, camp on the east side and west side was established in the spring, but some of them got, well. So that's, basically, the story of how, the Palatines, got here and were to produce the naval stores. It didn't work by the fall of 1712. The whole thing was abandoned, mainly because of the political, change, in England when Governor Hunter brought them over. The Whigs were in power, and literally on the way across the ocean, the Tories had taken over from the Whigs, and they weren't going to support a program that the Whigs had established. Same way today in a 2-party system, that maybe the Republicans wouldn't support a Democratic thing, or vice versa. So Hunter tried to keep it going. He actually spent almost 20,000 pounds of his wife's money, who was Lady Hay. And to get back to the 4 camps, the 4 camps were starting at the north, which is North Germantown today, was Ansbury, Queensbury, where the parsonage is, where we're sitting here in the library, Hunterstown, and Ansbury were the 4 camps. And the reason, why a lot of historians paint, Hunter and Livingston as the villains, because the Palatines were promised, after they were able to pay their passage over and stuff, that they would get 40 acres of land. But Hunter didn't give the land up, because the only collateral that he had to get his money back was the land. So it took him until 1723 to really, when 62 families decided to stay to really get a title to the land.
What were some of the names of the families that decided to stay? Are any of them still in town?
It's in a documentary history. You can get the exact 62 or 63 names, but obviously the people that can trace their ancestry back to 1710 were part of that 62 families, whether it's Hover, whether it's Hossackle, whether it's Coons, whether it's Finger, whether it's Sheffer or whatever. I mean, they were, for one reason or the other. I'm always interested in why in 1723 did some of the other people decide not to stay, because there were a few, I think less than 20, that opted not to stay and get the land. And some of them I know went to Pennsylvania and to the Carolinas, because the migration was once in 1712. The hunter had sort of set them, free to go, wherever they wanted, but they were always on call because he thought the naval sword thing was going to go. According to historians, up to almost half of them went to Schoharie. Ultimately, they went into the Mohawk Valley. Some of them went down into Pennsylvania, so they dispersed. But there's 62 families that said, yeah, we're going to stay. The 6,000 acres was promised us, and we're going to, and that's, what we know was Germantown today. It was part of Claremont that was ceded to Germantown in 1859, because the 6,000 acres, there was, Livingston didn't want any competition. Early maps, like the 1798 Wigmore map, you won't see any of the property once you come across the Roll of Chanson, anywhere near the Roll of Chanson Kill. That whole section stayed part of the Livingston, land holdings. And it wasn't until 1859 that they decided that it was easier if those people were governed by, the town of Germantown than have to go all the way to Claremont. So
you said there were a number of casualties on the trip over. Do we have any details about what that trip was like?
It was, if you had, if 3,000 people, started, you had 10 ships, a couple of them were military, ships, but, you have approximately, 300 people on a ship. The ship weren't that big, so it had to be crowded. The sad part about it is that in the fall of 1710, when it was starting, because they were put into these camps, Blackheath, there's a great wood carving of the Palatines being camped out. They were putting them in unheated warehouses in England and stuff. But now when the weather started getting bad, now they had to, figure something out. So what they did is they put them on ships the day before Christmas in 1709, but they weren't sure where they were going to go. So they kept sailing them around, and then finally they didn't leave until the spring of 1710. So that really added to the harshness of the trip and stuff, because they're sort of cooped up in this ship for, January, February, March, and the first ships didn't get here until June of 1710, when they finally decided that they were coming to New York. So that answers it. It was pretty harsh.
What was it like to be in one of the camps? What was the atmosphere or the setup, or what did it look like?
They were really small, parcels that they were given. They weren't, by short, 40 acres. They were very, very small parcels. They asked for seeds, it was a lot of historians will say that the first year was really tough and everything, but if you look at the letters that go back and forth between the Board of Trade, Governor Hunter, they had tents. I mean, it was called East Camp. They were provided with everything until the money went out. So, I mean, Hunter wasn't going to let them starve to death. He wasn't going to, you know, he tried as hard as he could to make that first, you know, year. I mean, imagine coming to, you know, this area in October with basically, you know, the clothes on your back and things like that. I mean, you know, winter is coming. They either lived in tents or they made, you know, crude houses. But, you know, as far as the food and things like that was all provided by Hunter.
Did the camps interact much? Or were they kind of, I know we had talked to a couple people who said when they were growing up, they didn't really leave their section to come to town. So I wonder in that age, were the camps separate or were they?
There's been some, you know, this whole migration that was so staggering. It was the single largest migration in colonial times. We hear all about the Mayflower. It was 103 people came over on Mayflower. Granted, it was 90 years early, but we're talking about, even with the deaths and stuff, we're talking about, at one time, Germantown had over 2,000 people. It was the third largest urban, you know, settlement in all of what we know as, you know, New York today. The population of Albany had less in 1714 than would have been here in 1710. So, you know, I just can't understand why there isn't more, you know, written about it, more, you know, understood about it. I think the camps were all, you had two different religions. There was slightly more than half that were Calvinist Reform, not to get confused with Dutch Reform. They were all, followed, you know, Calvin, and the other was Lutherans. And I'm sure that they sort of had made connections and stuff in the time that they were in England. If they came from the same section of Germany and stuff, that they tried to keep that identity in the camps. So I think the camps, you know, were closed, but I'm sure that, you know, there was, you know, religion involved, there was territory involved, extended families, you know, some, you know, brothers came over, you know, people that had lived in you know, next door to other people. So I think the camps were set up, you know, in that way.
What kind of hardships would they have to have faced at that time?
Here in Germantown?
Yeah, in this area.
Well, like I said before, as long as the money, you know, was there to provide them, things were pretty good. But then by the fall of 1711, after they'd been here a year, now things are starting to deteriorate because Hunter has to use his own money, England isn't providing, so it becomes harsher and harsher. You'll read stories where, you know, there was two ministers, you know, Coberthal came, you know, back with the group, and the other reform minister was Hager. And historians will always point to this letter that Hager is writing back in 1712, where how miserable the conditions are now, where they're boiling grass to eat and things like that. How much of that is factual, or if he was just trying to embellish the story to get, you know, money from the group called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, was a reformed, you know, Anglican group in England that was supplying money also for, you know, this effort.
So when the group of families that decided to stay made that decision, where did they start to build the community? What did they start with? Where, you know, what was the foundation of this community?
In 1723 or 24, you know, when Cadwalader, you know, Colden, who was a surveyor general, you know, resurveyed the property, but then it was like another 20 years before they actually got indentures to the property. They were allowed to keep the parcel that they were physically living on, and then there were bigger areas of the 6,000 acres that was put in trust for everybody, you know, what was called in common, which was very common in those days. You know, Kingston had a common land, you know, Beekman had a common land, and now those people were able to deal with the four, you know, people that were set up as trustees for that land to get other land. So it was a process of now you can build. It's no coincidence that you don't see anything much built before 1750, like the Rockefeller House, like the Stone Jug, like the Parsons, because it's in limbo. They don't have that document, so they're not going to build anything substantial. And then, you know, from then on, it's sort of, you know, they start, you know, farming the land, and, you know, fishing, I think, was very important and stuff like that to make a living. But those 60-some families must have felt that this was the best option, you know, that they had instead of moving on.
As someone who's very interested in the history and obviously spends a lot of time going over and going over, when you are in town and you're around town, are there certain things that you see that that kind of bring you back to 1700s, and or is all that stuff kind of gone?
Like I said, I went to the Germantown School District. I had no clue why it was called Germantown. Didn't know that, you know, the Palatine migration. Didn't know I had to be an ancestor of the single largest migration in colonial times. Everything had been pretty much forgotten. There was nothing like, if you go to Pennsylvania, you go to the Mohawk Valley, you go to the Schoharie Valley, they kept that, you know, that tradition. I mean, they were in the Schoharie Valley by, you know, 1714, and there was never a gap. But here in Germantown, Helen Henderson, who was my third grade teacher, 102, theoretically could have talked to her grandparents that were born, you know, in the early 1800s. There was nothing, the food, you know, the architecture, nothing that would, you know, blare out that this was a German, you know, settlement, just, you know, the name Germantown. It wasn't until, you know, the two churches still spoke German when Lafayette came up, you know, he made his grand, return here in 1825, and he talks about a small village still above Claremont. He came to Claremont to visit with the Livingstons, you know, down there, and he came up and he said just above, you know, Claremont, there's this little village that still speaks German. So in that, you know, that time frame between, you know, the 1820s until Helen's, you know, grandparents or other people, it completely disappears. And I think the reason for that was the compulsory education law of 1612. That now the children were, before that they were taught, you know, either at home or the churches, and they, you know, German, I'm sure, was the language. But after the compulsory education, you know, law, now the children are speaking English, and now they're coming home. Their parents are speaking a different, you know, language, and I think it wasn't cool anymore to get the language as quick as they could and stuff like that. So it just disappears.
To go back a bit, when the Palatines first came over to this area, what was here? Who were the people already here? Or was it all just?
Great question. I mean, Livingston had 160,000 acres. You know, his thing was that, you know, he's going to, you know, make, you know, money, you know, off of that he's going to lease all of these farms and stuff. So when he sold the 6,000 acres back, he made sure, like I said before, nobody was going to compete with him for a mill or anything like that. The soil was clay. The couple years that the Palatines are here are complaining that they can't grow, their vegetable garden and stuff like that. So, the land wasn't all that, great for your farm. It wasn't until years later when they figured out they could grow fruit trees and things like that that they became, prosperous as far as farmers.
You had mentioned that there are some of the same names in the town today that came over in the 1710. What is it, not necessarily about the Palatines, but moving forward in history, what do you think it is about this town that's caused those same names to stay around?
I'm not quite sure, but I think there are certain people that are adventurous. If you look at the families that came over, they were basically maybe 4 to a family, maybe a husband and wife and 2 children or something like that. So, but once they got here and stuff, the more adventurous ones, possibly, moved away. My ancestors moved no further than 5 miles, ever. They went off the 6,000 acres, but they immediately went off the 6,000 acres up towards the roll of Jansen, worked on one of the mills that Livingston had acquired. My great-grandfather was able to buy 60 acres in the hamlet of Linlithgow, that is basically 5 miles from the center of Germantown. So if you use him, or my ancestors as an example, they weren't anxious to move, much farther.
At one point, Germantown was a very strong farming town. Do you think that came out of necessity, or was that the plan all along to set up shop and grow and produce?
The breakdown, and again, here's another area where somebody should be looking at, more closely of the people that came over. They were mostly farmers, vintners, people that were raising grapes and stuff like that. But there was a large percentage of people with trades, but the trades were trades that were related to farming. Whether you're a blacksmith, whether you're a cooper making barrels, whether you're, doing, other things. So, I mean, that was, the basis of the knowledge of the people that stayed were farming. So I'm sure they tried. There's a couple by the 1760s are shipping fruit out of here. There's a quote from a gentleman that comes in 1750, and I have his book, here, and it's just a great, quote, because he comes with Conrad Weiser, who was one of the most famous of the Palatines. Conrad Weiser was the chief Indian interpreter for not only, Pennsylvania, but the Carolinas, and now he's making a trip in 1750. He brings this young gentleman with him, either Christian Daniel Kloss or Daniel Christian Kloss. The book is in my BDKs. And they stop in Germantown. And this kid is a 22-year-old that just happened to have came from the same village as Conrad Weiser had came from. So Conrad Weiser now was in his 50s when he makes the trips. He came here as a 9-year-old to the camps with his dad. So that's the reason he stops here, because, there are people that, that he knew. And they have a meal in what we know now is Queensberry on, Sharp's Landing, road. And they have this meal. And the young guy is saying how beautiful the country is, and the meal and the grapes are, as good as anything that he had in Europe. And this is in 1750. And he talks about looking across the Hudson River to the Embuff and seeing all the orchards that are planted over there. So I'm sure that, the same is on this side.
Do you think it was by design, or was it by accident that the group that came over seemed to have a very farm-heavy experience. They were farmers or had a trade that was related to farming. Was that something that they had planned, or was it something that kind of just so happened?
Well, in that time between, 1708 was the the winter of 1708, 1709 was the most severe ever recorded in Europe. We were still in what was called the mini ice age, and the vines had sort of froze. The wars had been going on and everything. So these were the people that were, and they asked a lot of, the people that came over had to give a reason for leaving whatever, little state that they came from and stuff. And the main reason was to make it was for land and make a better life for their children. So, I mean, that's the mindset that they had when they came over here. And, again, they were mostly, farmers, and stuff that came over. So naturally, they're going to try, to farm. That's why Schoharie was such a great, lure to them, because they knew that over there, the Schoharie River was a fruitful valley. It reminded them of the Rhine and things like that. So the more adventurous, went there, and they became extremely successful farmers. By the time of the Revolution, that was the breadbasket of the Revolution, till the French and Indians came down. But they were admired as farmers there, and they're basically the same, people from the same areas. Unfortunately, the people here didn't have that kind of land. They had to be a little bit more imaginative and do things a little bit differently here, because they didn't have that beautiful, valley that the other people had.
Is there any other information that you think is important for people to know about the Palatines?
Just that it's, amazing that there isn't more, written about that migration, and there isn't, more awareness how, significant it was.
Mom, can you think of anything off the top of your head that you might want to ask about, or?
I'm just thinking that it might be, Alvin might be able to give a little detail about what it was like for families when you had to be conscripted to war. What that did, what that period of time, what that war was, and what the period of time was, and a little few details about how the families were broken apart.
Yeah, as far as before they came over here, when they were in Europe, or?
No, I don't mean here. I mean when they already got here, and then it was a mandatory conscription of several. They were still.
Again, that pertained to the War of the Spanish Succession, or what they talked about in this country was Queen Anne's War, one of the French and Indian wars that was going, on, and it just so happened in the spring of 1711. England decided that they were going to invade France. So, Hunter asked, Livingston and, some of the other people to, muster, I think it was, 300, people. So naturally, a lot of the Palatine men enlisted for that expedition. They never, it never materialized, because they got as far as, Saratoga, and the Navy decided it was getting, late in the year and stuff. So, but while they were away was when things started to go, bad. So then, when they came back, they seen that their families weren't being provided with the food. So that made the hardship and stuff, but it was just a perfect storm, thing or something. It just so happened that, less than a year after they're settled here, now all of a sudden 300 of the men have to, leave their families and go on now, and that's when you get the stories like Hager, saying that they were never ever content with the situation here. The Germans that stayed, but even before the naval thing, I mean, Hunter had to bring, some soldiers down. One time they marched up to his manor house and demanded, certain things and stuff like that. So it was a contentious thing. They were all provided with firearms, but that didn't last too many months. They were taken away from them. They had to all march up to the mouth of the Rojan where, Robert Livingston lived, and they had to turn in their firearms and things. So it wasn't, they weren't as willing because they wanted to farm. They wanted this better land, and they thought that Germantown was going to provide that. But then when they got here, the most demeaning job in Europe was going to the forest and burn charcoal, and now they're asked to go in the forest and make naval stores and stuff. And the Pine Woods wasn't actually on the 6,000 acres. That was in what we know as Claremont. They had to march 5 miles over to where they started to do, the naval stores. They did supposedly prepare up to 100,000 trees in the documentary history where Bridger to produce the naval stores. The tar and the turpentine was basically a 3-year process. You tapped the tree 1 year, then you moved around, you tapped, on the other side, and then, after 3 years, you could start, producing. The only, tar they ever produced was the knots that the children and stuff picked up, and they processed that. They never actually processed a gallon of tar or turpentine or stuff, like that. But that was, part of the hardship, also that, and, most of the men, weren't employed, all the time because, the thing was just never getting off. So they were just, parked here from the, the fall of 1710 until the fall of 1712. A lot of idle time, a lot of things going on, a lot of hate, a lot of, resentment for the way they said that the contract that they signed in England wasn't, the same as, because, there was a language difference, there was, awfully on, so it was a contentious, 2 years. And again, the 62 families, they also went through that, but they decided, 10 years later in, 1723, that this is the place that they were going to make that dream that they had, left in Europe for, more land, and a better, life for their children through farming.
Do we know when in history these camps became what we now know as Germantown? When the name was adopted?
Yeah, that's sort of a, interesting, question, because on early maps, the only thing we have now, we have East Camp Road, we have, Camp Creek, and those, started, sort of, held on. But there was a Dr. Wilson that came here as a personal physician for Chancellor Livingston in, I believe, the 1780s, and he's still in his journal, he's going to the camps. And then it changes to the Germantown, and then it finally becomes, Germantown. So by the revolution, or, but it's, it was the camps, and there's some earlier maps and stuff that'll show it as the camps.
Great. We like to end each interview with the same 4 questions. It's going to be a little bit off for you because we aren't talking so much about your history, but or your personal history, but we still like to get the same questions in. So the first question is, for you, what has changed the most in Germantown since you've grown up?
The move away from farming, I mean, in the 50s and 60s, there was a tremendous amount of fruit. My first job when I was, still in high school was working for a gentleman who happened to be a Palatine descendant, but I guarantee you, I worked part-time for him for 3 years, and the word Palatine, or neither one of us ever, mentioned it. He had a small farm. He had a road stand. He grew vegetables. He had some fruit trees, and he made a great living, in the 50s. So my whole, childhood memory of Germantown was 3 large cold storages, some commercial fishing, going on. I had a boat as a young, kid. I think at 16 I got my first boat. I was on the river a lot. You seen, in the spring you seen people fishing for shad, sturgeon, and things like that. And now, today there's a moratorium on fishing for shad or sturgeon because of pollution and diminishing. So that was taken away from the local people. Farming is still somewhat of a business, but nothing like all of the cold storages are gone and stuff like that. And then to come up to the last 20 years is the amount of second homes, people coming up for what I believe is the best view of the high Catskills. The scenery. It's just a great place for these people that come up. I mean, they tend to migrate from large urban areas. I mean, Rhinebeck had a lot of people coming in earlier. And the same with Albany, but now it's Germantown's, turn to be the place, because real estate is a little bit, less expensive here than it is in Rhinebeck. And 9/11 had a lot to do with it. A lot of people decided that, that had either second homes here, that they could commute and stuff like that. I know, like, counties like Orange County and stuff had, even Saugerties, which is almost across from here, had a big influx of people from New York City after 9/11.
On the other hand, what for you has stayed the same? What's the constant of Germantown?
The school district has not really, where other places now you have, school districts where the enrollment is literally thousands of children, and the Germantown school district has pretty much stayed, the same. I was fortunate that my 2 children and my grandson now goes to, what I consider a small, school. Even, it is still rural today compared to, a lot of other places. It hasn't got to a point where you don't see a lot of gigantic, housing, developments and stuff like that. It's usually single, family homes, or buying older homes that now the people that farmed, made a living, couldn't, support anymore. And now, the newer people are coming in and refurbishing those homes. I don't know if that answers your question.
What does Germantown mean to you personally?
I'm a traditionalist. Like I said, my family's only moved 5 miles away. It's a place that, I went to the school, through the Germantown School District, but there was a big gap in, from the time I graduated. I never was interested in the history of Germantown. I belonged to 5 historical societies in Ulster County before I ever even joined the Columbia County Historical Society, where I got involved here, because it just didn't seem to be as exciting as Kingston, which had 2 Native American, wars, and the canal that brought all the coal and bluestone, and things like that. And it was just, community. But I mean, even though I live 5 miles above, I'm gonna, die here. I'm not gonna go to Florida unless we have a couple more winters like this. I might, decide to. But no, I'm a traditionalist, and I think this is a great place to, to live. when I read, books by people like Shirley Dunn and stuff, and she'll say that the best view of the high, Catskills is from North Germantown, Doc, it has a lot